thanks to Rick Baker and the Grant Chamber for inviting me to speak today and for putting this event together. I'm very honored to be here with David Walker. Today's topic, solving America's debt crisis, is timely. In my 15 months in Congress, almost every debate we've had has involved the debt. The biggest headlines from last year were the 2012 House budget and the debt ceiling deal. The biggest headline so far this year was last week's passage of the 2013 budget. I'll start with the bad news first. There's still not a majority in the House or Senate that understands the urgency of the debt crisis. And bipartisan compromise just is not there right now. The good news is that the tide is turning, thanks largely to the freshman class. They get it. They understand we need to act now. They understand compromise, and we're getting some results. When we came to Congress, we promised to change the institution. We hoped leadership would be open to change. And to his credit, Speaker Baker has opened up the legislative process so that anyone's ideas can be brought forward and debated. That made his job harder than it needed to be, and I really admire him for that. But leadership still maintained firm control in the process. One of the things they did was convince the freshmen that most of our votes didn't matter. We should hold our fire for the debt ceiling vote. Every day we were reminded that Republicans are a family, and families stick together, and that we need to, quote, break the Democrats' foundation so that we can stand strong on the big fight ahead, the debt ceiling. This strategy kept us fairly united for much of 2011, but it had some downsides. It raised the stakes of the debt deal. Also, this idea of breaking the Democrats' foundation didn't make it easy to find reasonable policy compromise. If you're in a constant take no prisoners political war, it's not easy to talk to the other side, let alone trust them. Meanwhile, Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, kept making irrational statements. He kept moving the deadline for raising the debt ceiling. He kept spreading about defaults, even though there was no chance of government default. The government takes in more than enough revenue to pay the interest on the debt. That's not my opinion, it's just simple math. So the real threat was not default, but major reforms to government. The Speaker said we would agree to raise the debt ceiling only if we received dollar for dollar cut in federal spending. That sounded like a good deal, but it wasn't. Why? Because timing matters. We'd raise the debt ceiling right away by $2.1 trillion, but the matching cuts would be spread over 10 years. And it would be backloaded, so that the biggest cuts would occur years after the debt ceiling was raised. In the first year, the year that counts, we cut only $21 billion. Our recent budgets are around $3,500 billion. And the deficit is around $1,200 billion. So this historic deal would reduce our deficit from $1.2 trillion to $1.2 trillion. In other words, not at all. Now, this wasn't a compromise. It was an incumbency protection plan. A genuine compromise requires both parties to make concessions. A genuine compromise has us acting like adults and treating the American people like adults. I couldn't possibly support that deal. In fact, many of us in the freshman class were begging the senior members to accept closing tax loopholes, eliminating oil subsidies, eliminating farm subsidies, reforming military spending. That's the only way we can win the real reforms to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which are the biggest drivers of the debt. If we don't reform those entitlement programs, then we can't resolve our budget problem. But a lot of the veteran members are incredibly stubborn. I never saw anything like this in the State House, and I have some of my former State House colleagues in here. It just was not like this. So we ended up with no real reforms and another political deal. As part of the deal, Congress created a super committee. If the super committee didn't find at least $1 trillion in savings over 10 years, which again is less than our annual deficit, so it's $1 trillion in savings over 10 years, spending had to be cut automatically across the board. As you know, the super committee failed, and we're supposed to have automatic cuts starting next year. Guess what? The new House budget rejects the legally required cuts for 2013. Keep in mind that the only practical thing a budget does is set discretionary spending levels for the coming fiscal year, 2013. But the House budget ignores the required discretionary cuts and simply promises to replace them with reforms to entitlements in the future. That should sound familiar. It's the same Ponzi scheme they keep using. Spend now, cut later. It's exactly the same formula from the debt ceiling deal. The budget should have made real policy compromises. Instead, we have a Republican political tract that doesn't get us close to where we need to be. It completely ignores the concerns of the other party. It doesn't even propose to balance until nearly 2040, which means our debt will continue to go up until 2040. It's not even credible to say you're planning to balance the budget so long from now, when no current reps will still be in Congress, except maybe John Dingell. No one can predict spending over 30 years, or whether we'll have a Republican majority to stick to the budget, or whether an economy can sustain growing the debt for another 10 years, much less 20 or 30, without bankrupting us. We need immediate action. Take a look at military spending. It's second only to Social Security in the budget. The U.S. spends about as much on our military as all other countries of the world combined. Think about that. All other countries of the world combined. There's over 200 countries. We spend about the same amount as all of them. Under the new House budget, military spending actually goes up. Of course, much of that spending is appropriate. Defense is a core constitutional function, but some of that spending should go. Some of it is wasted on pet projects that don't enhance our defense. Some of it is spent on unnecessary missions. Some of it subsidizes Western Europe, so they can blow money on other things. What gives me hope is that so many freshman Republican members of the Budget Committee were insisting that leadership consider real compromises on military spending, on subsidies, on special tax breaks. It's been a real shock to our leadership, and it's not often reported in the news. And I'm confident that over time, people will see that the ongoing dysfunction in DC comes from the people who got us in this mess in the first place. I'm also optimistic because of the renewed support for a balanced budget amendment. If the politicians won't balance things, then let's force them to. And the best way to force balance is through a constitutional amendment. I spent most of my first year developing a balanced budget proposal that has unique bipartisan features. Instead of an annual balance, my proposal limits current year spending to the average revenues of the previous 3 years. That means that the federal government can deficit spend in a recession. But usually, it will run small surpluses that pay down the debt. It makes for smoother, more predictable spending. And unlike a lot of the Republican proposals, it doesn't take a supermajority to raise taxes. I decided early on that I wanted to be the most bipartisan of the various balanced budget proposals. I worked closely with a couple Democrats, Dan Lipinski from Illinois and Jared Polis from Colorado. We worked to tweak it. I went to other reps' offices to sit down and talk with them about it. My staff literally contacted hundreds of offices. And the best part was that some Democrats said I was the first Republican ever to come to their office to pitch a proposal. Think about that. Think about the level of dysfunction we have in Washington if I was the first Republican to visit them. The happy ending to the story, and the reason I remain optimistic, is that I got a number of unexpected co-sponsorships on my bill. There are a lot of people in DC completely baffled by it. In fact, my proposal has broader bipartisan support than any new balanced budget proposal in the past 2 decades. Take Jim Moran. He's a very liberal Democrat from a suburb, a Virginia suburb near D.C. I'm a conservative Republican from West Michigan. He's 66, I'm 31. He believes you should subsidize the arts in his district. I went to the House floor to strip funding for a concert venue in his district. We don't see eye to eye on many issues. But because I took the time to sit down with him, mine is the only balanced budget proposal he has co-sponsored. Solving the government's fiscal crisis requires that kind of attitude and effort. A growing number of us in Congress understand the urgency of the crisis. We're willing to take the risk to work toward a bipartisan compromise that will accomplish this goal. Thanks for your time this afternoon, and enjoy the main event. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Jandernoa.
Thank you, Congressman Amash, and not just from your perspective in Washington, but certainly for your tireless effort to advocate for us in Congress and address this federal deficit and the implications that it does have on all of our future, especially the younger generation. Your comments today are, in addition to all the facts that we want to review with Mr. Walker, will lay out and will be informative, but unfortunately extremely unnerving as we go through some of these details. So, as was announced, my name is Mike Jandernoa, and rather than talking about my business career or any of that, talk a little bit about why I'm here and looking at this issue of the federal deficits and the unfunded liabilities. And it's really about the next generation and the generation after that. Many of us in the room have kids, or some of us even have grandkids. And so for me, this issue is about them and having an opportunity that we've had in our generation in America to have that generational opportunity continue for the future. So there was an old bumper sticker that said, "What do you mean I don't have any money? I still have a lot of checks." You know, the United States has been spending more money than it's been bringing in for far too long. And unfortunately, that bill is starting to come due right now, and the cupboard is almost bare. Unfortunately, the vast majority of Americans don't realize that how bare the cupboard is and how all of these unfunded liabilities are sneaking up on us and about ready to take over the country and have consequences that none of us want to face. So, as we look at this issue, the deficits have been increasing for a long, long time. If we look just at the last year, the deficits were up over $1.3 trillion in this past fiscal year. So they've been escalating and growing ever faster. All those deficits, of course, add to the debt. Right, good. And beyond the debt, we have what? Sneaking out there, unfunded liabilities, all these promises we've made, especially to older people and retired people, and a lot of it healthcare related, those are called those entitlement issues. So many of us are really tired of hearing about the financial crisis in Greece and Spain and Italy. You know, you hear it on the news, the stock market goes up, and all of a sudden it falls off 100 points, and the problem is Greece. And they didn't get the debt settlement, and they didn't take the big crush down and haircut that they needed to get the support of the rest of the EU. You know, we're tired of that, but it may be something that's looking at and predicting our future, unfortunately, unless we as a country are willing to make some of the changes that the Congressman was talking about, and that we'll have an opportunity to hear from Mr. Walker about. So. I had the opportunity this past year to become aware of this issue, and I first heard it from David Walker on CNBC, and then there's a couple others, and I've passed out some stuff at the tables that may tell you about that, about 3 different groups looking at this unfunded liability and finally bringing it certainly to my attention, and we wanted to bring it to more people's attention. But the fact of bringing out the unfunded liabilities, it meant that that big debt ceiling crisis and all the dialogue back and forth when we went through in August, we said the U.S. had 8 to 10 years before we would be in the same problem as Greece and Italy and Spain. Unfortunately, we didn't think about or contemplate the unfunded liabilities. It's not 8 to 10, it's 3 to 4 years before we face a really significant crisis and go off that cliff that the congressman was talking about. So, and in all the noise that Greece has created, remember, they've got a country. It's a small country. It's 11 million people. It's $300 billion from an economy. It's nothing of the size that we have here in the United States. So to play around with an economy the size of the United States and not address this is really not conscionable. I reflect on a movie. There was a movie, maybe some of you remember, the Charlie Wilson's War. And there was this woman, Julia Roberts, who played the character, and she turned to Tom Hanks and said, "Why is Congress saying one thing and doing nothing?" Tom Hanks responded in a funny, but unfortunately disturbingly familiar way. He said, "Well, it's tradition, mostly." All right? Why are they saying one thing and doing nothing? It's tradition. So, if Congress continues along that path of not addressing this debt and deficit issue, it's going to be the greatest threat to our country's sovereignty. And as we look at it, in Michigan, I was fortunate to be part of a group that started the Business Leaders for Michigan, and we focused on having an idea of having a turnaround plan, a plan for the state of Michigan. And that was something that we hadn't had around here in a long, long time. And we developed that plan. We took it and we shared it with other business leaders. We took it and shared it with elected officials and all those candidates who were running for office. We wanted them to know what our plan was to turn the state around and enable Michigan to stop losing jobs and come back to the top of the top 10 states where we used to be. So thank God that we got enough people elected that supported the turnaround plan, and with the leadership of Governor Snyder and the legislature, I believe they've made significant steps and strides in implementing that turnaround plan. We're far from completing that turnaround plan. We've got a lot more work to do, but the progress they've made in 18 months has been remarkable. So as we look at that, I feel now we need a turnaround plan for our country. And I think that's the same type of thought process. It needs to be a plan, and a plan that we understand. So I'm pleased to have a chance to introduce our keynote speaker today, who's been helping to educate American people on the realities of the debt, and more importantly, not just the realities of the debt, but how we can address it. And David Walker, who's the former U.S. Comptroller for both a Republican and Democrat, Clinton and Bush, and has served as the chief auditor of the federal government. And this is one of his 3 presidential appointments. So he worked in the private sector in public accounting. He's worked in the government sector. He's worked in Washington. He's done a lot of different experiences that give him insight and input into how we could address this issue. During his time as comptroller, David was focused on showing Congress the financial implications of their policy decisions and the impact on the future. And that's one of the things I admire about David Walker. He's thinking about the future. What are we doing today that will impact the future? And unfortunately, we've not been doing that in Washington for quite some time. So as we look at that, we want to make sure that the effort that David Walker has started with Come Back America Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization, gets a chance to have an impact and reach more people. He's now bringing that message directly to the public by promoting the fiscal responsibility and engaging groups like never before on this debt issue and the unfunded liabilities and obligations. So there'll be a time for questions after Dave's comments. And I want to encourage you, there are some cards at your tables that if you'd like to write out a question, please do that. He's very anxious to have questions, and he'd like hard questions so that we get to the root of the problems. But certainly after talking with Dave this morning at breakfast, I'm more confident than ever that you will learn a great deal, not just about the problem, but most importantly about solutions to our problems. Please welcome Dave Walker.
Mike, thanks for that kind introduction. Congressman, Mr. Mayor, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. I know it's spring break. It's a great crowd for spring break. Thanks in particular for the young people who be with us. We've got a good intergenerational crowd, and I think that's appropriate given the subject. It's my first time in Grand Rapids. I've been in Michigan many times. I've been to all 50 states and about 100 countries during my lifetime. But Grand Rapids is rather relevant for me in my political history because I was born in the South and I was something called a Southern Democrat when there was something like that. That was called a conservative Democrat. And I changed parties in 1976 and became a Republican for 3 reasons. One, I realized the Democratic Party, at least the party, was way too liberal for me. Secondly, I believe that Gerald Ford deserved to be elected President of the United States. And thirdly, I didn't think that Jimmy Carter would be a good president, although I thought he was a nice guy. I think I might have been right on all 3, quite frankly. And so I'm ahead of my time on a lot of things, and now I want to talk to you about the nation's finances. I'm going to tell you the truth, talk about the tough choices, and some of the potential solutions to solve our problem. Let me start with this. This is the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, the greatest political document in the history of mankind. The preamble was actually not written until after the Constitution was enacted, but it was written by the founders as a way to kind of help explain what they intended. If you look at the words that are bolded and underlined, you'll see that there are differences between those words as to the degree of responsibility for the federal government. Promote does not mean provide. Just check Webster's dictionary. The simple fact of the matter is that this country was also intended to recognize that states are sovereign entities. And it was intended to be that the federal government should only do those things where the powers weren't reserved to the states or the people. And you can see this. This is an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And if you look at the framing of our country, you'll find that our country was founded on certain timeless principles and values. Look, things evolve. I believe in continuous improvement. I believe in evolution. But I also believe that there are certain principles and values that are so important that they are the foundation of progress and they are timeless in nature. And these are some of the ones that are relevant to my topic today. Limited but effective government. Individual liberty and opportunity. Personal responsibility and accountability. Fiscal responsibility and intergenerational equity, and rule of law and equal justice under the law. Ladies and gentlemen, we're violating every one of those today to differing degrees. America is a great country. Not as great as we think we are, but we're a great country. But we have strayed from the principles and values that made us great, and as a result we face a range of key sustainability challenges that literally threaten our future economy, our future position in the world, our future standard of living at home, and the future domestic tranquility in our streets. We have to face reality. And we have a political process today that is dysfunctional. We have a republic that is not representative of or responsive to the public. And you'll hear more about that. In 1800, the federal government was 2% of the U.S. economy. Frankly, 200 years ago, or probably as recently as 1880, it was only 2.5% of the economy. Last year, it was 24% of the economy. It's headed to 37% of the economy on autopilot. If you add state and local government, government would be over 50% of the U.S. economy by 2040. Look, I'm not an anti-government person. There are a number of things that government needs to do that the private sector can't or shouldn't do. But the fact is that having spent 20 years in the private sector, 15 in government, 4 in the nonprofit sector, I also know that government is not the engine of growth, innovation, and job creation. This is not a prescription for prosperity. And in addition to the fact that government's gotten too big, It's grown too big, promised too much, waited too long to restructure. The composition of what government's doing has changed fundamentally. If you look 40 years ago, most of the budget was for defense, 42%. Now that's down to less than 20%. If you look at 40 years ago, over 60% of the budget was decided by Congress every year, so-called discretionary spending. Last year, less than 40% of the budget was deemed to be discretionary, and it's being taken over by so-called entitlement programs. I don't like to call them that. I call them social insurance programs because they're not entitlements, according to the Supreme Court. But the fact is that we're spending more and more on consumption, more and more on seniors, more and more of our budget is on autopilot, less and less is being controlled, less and less for investment, less and less for young people. That is not only irresponsible, it is unethical, it is immoral, and it must stop. By the way, the discretionary spending, which is about 37% of federal spending, includes all of the express and enumerated responsibilities envisioned by the Founding Fathers for the federal government. 100%. So it's gotten bigger, the nature of what it's doing is different. That's to demonstrate. Here are federal revenues and outlays as a percentage of the economy. If it's red, it means the Republicans control the House and the Senate. If it's blue, it means the Democrats control the House and the Senate. If it's mixed, it means it was split. And if you have really good eyes, you can see who controlled the White House. This is adjusted for inflation. The dotted line represents revenue. So if the solid's above the dotted, that's called a deficit. Guess what? Spending is a bipartisan problem. There's not a party of fiscal responsibility. There are people who are, just not enough of them. The fact of the matter is that we've been totally out of control in the last 11 years. And Congress has been controlled by both parties during that period of time. It's been split during part of the time. And we've had presidents of both political parties during the last 11 years. The last 11 years have been the most fiscally irresponsible in the history of the United States. And George W. Bush was the most fiscally irresponsible president until the current incumbent. And that is the problem. If we look from George Washington to William Jefferson Clinton, we accumulated $5.6 trillion in debt. We way more than doubled that since 2000, and we could double again in the next 10 years. And if we look through history, and if we count not just debt owed to the public, but the debt that we owe to Social Security and Medicare's trust funds, it's real. It's several $trillions. It's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. It's guaranteed as to principal interest. We will not default on it, which government doesn't want to count, by the way, but I do, and you should. They're duplicitous. They want to tell people you can count on this. On the other hand, we don't want to count the liability. I mean, we don't owe that right now. We owe that, kind of down the road because we're paying all this stuff on a cash flow basis. You will see that only one time in the history of the United States until now has debt been over 100% of GDP. That was World War II. Not to win our independence, not the War of 1812, not the Civil War, not World War I, only World War II. Well, frankly, we got something for World War II. We defeated the Axis powers. We saved the free world. We were over about 50% of the global economy after World War II. The dollar was as good as gold. That's not how it is today. Now we are over 100% of GDP when you count what we owe Social Security and Medicare, and we are adding debt at record rates. And how about interest in debt? This represents interest that we pay on debt, and the dollar and the solid black line represents the effective interest rate. Here's the truth. We have historically low interest rates. We have the lowest average maturity of any major sovereign nation on debt, which means we have huge interest rate risk. So when, not if, when interest rates turn around, for every 100 basis points, 1% increase in interest rates, that will cost the federal government $150 billion. And what do you get for interest? As we say in the South, shinola, nothing. Interest is what you pay for past excess consumption. It is the fastest growing expense in the federal government, and by President Obama's own a budget projection, we will be paying nearly $1 trillion a year in interest in 10 years. And what do you get for that? Shinola. And the real problem is not today's deficits, 1.3 trillion, not today's debt, 15.5 trillion. The real problem is what you don't see. You know, this month is the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. And the Titanic was sunk by an iceberg. Now, as you know, on an iceberg, you can see the ice that's above the water, but the real threat is what you don't see, which is multiple times greater below the waterline. Same thing for the government's finances. We can see the deficits and the debt, but what the real threat is the huge ice below the water that could literally sink the ship of state. $37 trillion in unfunded obligations for Medicare. $9 trillion in unfunded obligations for Social Security. A range of other commitments and contingencies that, when aggregated with debt and pension and retiree health obligations, as of the end of last fiscal year, $65 trillion. Now, how do you relate to that number? Well, that's 200,000 plus for every man, woman, child in America, including newborn babies. No wonder newborn babies cry. That's over $500,000 for every household or taxpayer in America. Median household income in America is $50,000. So that means that the typical household has an implicit second or third mortgage equal to 11 times median household income and no house to back that mortgage. And by the way, the 65.5, because of a simple concept of math, the new four-letter word, and the power of compounding goes up 2 to 3 trillion a year for every year that we continue to do nothing. 2 to 3 trillion a year. Oh, by the way, that's with a balanced budget. Okay. And we're a long way from a balanced budget. If a household managed its finances like the U.S. government, this is what it would look like. Median household income, $50,000 a year. That's $966 a week. So you take in $966 a week, you're spending $1496 a week. That's a deficit of $536 a week, with household debt of $314,000, and then when you really consider all the other commitments you've made, real debt of $1.3 million, when your annual household income is $50,000. Would you want to be in that household? You can't run your family that way. We can't run businesses that way. We should not allow our country to be run this way. And when you compare us to other countries, and you use honest accounting, which typically is not used, then you must add total federal, state, and local debt as a percentage of the economy to compare to European nations, because they finance differently. And when you do that, you will find that we are already worse than Spain. We're already worse than other countries that are on the news. And then when you add what we owe Social Security and Medicare, which is the dark part on the United States, you'll see that we are within 2 years of where Greece was when they had their crisis. Now, we're not Greece. You know, they're a small country, small population, small GDP. We're the largest economy on earth, the temporary sole superpower. Our currency, the dollar, represents over 60% of the world's global reserve currency. So that means that we have more time, not unlimited time. It means that we're a safe haven from the temporary uncertainties in Europe, but not a permanent safe haven. We are not exempt from the laws of prudent finance. You cannot expend more money than you take in, indefinitely charge with the credit card, and not expect a day of reckoning. And ours will come within the next 4 years. And so we must make sure that this is a top issue in the presidential election, so it can be a priority, so that we can start diffusing this ticking debt bomb, and that we can start making tough choices in 2013, like other countries have already done, so that we can make sure that we keep America great and that our future will be better than our past. And unlike at the end of World War II, when we had the highest debt in our history, we owed it all to Americans. Americans saved, they invested, they bought war bonds. And so therefore the interest stayed in our country. We were paying ourselves interest. But now, about half of our public debt is held by foreign lenders. That means, look, interest payments go overseas. It helps them, it doesn't help us. That means that they have more leverage on us. on things like foreign policy and economic and trade issues and things of that nature. And by the way, who's the largest holder of U.S. debt? Anybody want to guess? Well, for countries, it's China, but you know the largest holder of our debt? The Federal Reserve. We're self-dealing in our own debt. We are buying our own debt in order to keep interest rates down, in order to stimulate economic growth, and in order to keep housing mortgage costs down and try to stabilize the housing market. You can do that short term. You can't do that forever. Ultimately, market forces will take over. So fiscal policy, which is tax and spend, monetary policy, which is money supply, are both improved and unsustainable right now. We're going to have to correct both, and we need to get on with them. Now, if you rank countries, the Comeback America Initiative, which I head, nonpartisan facts, nonpartisan solutions that can get bipartisan support, rank countries based on IMF data, International Monetary Fund, and number 1 in the world, Australia, for fiscal responsibility and sustainability. Number 34, and we only rank 34, Greece. You can understand that. Where are we? An embarrassing 28. Down dramatically in the last 11 years. Below Spain, below Italy, in a bad neighborhood. We need to move on up. We need to move on up. And if you look at the fiscal future, the line represents revenues as a percentage of the economy. Inflation's taken out. The bars represent spending. The bars above the line, that's called a deficit, which adds to debt. Fastest growing expense, interest. And what do you get for interest? Chinola. Okay? Second fastest growing expense, healthcare. If there's one thing that can bankrupt America, it's healthcare. Do you know that we're the only major industrialized nation that doesn't have a budget for what it allocates to spend on healthcare at the government level? The only one. Nobody else has done enough to do that. Even countries that have socialized medicine cradle to grave, I'm not advocating that. Sweden has socialized medicine cradle to grave, and they have limits. States do. Oregon and others have limits. You can't write a blank check for health care. It'll bankrupt you. If you look at health care costs, we spend double per person, and we have higher infant mortality, lower life expectancy, higher hospital error rates, higher readmissions. So if you're wealthy, you have a good system, but from a societal standpoint, we're getting poor value for money. Is the answer to just throw more money at a system where you're spending double per person to get below average results? I don't think so. I think we need dramatic and fundamental reform. By the way, there's another system that we spend double per person and we get below average results. Anybody want to guess? K through 12 education. Double per person, below average results. We need dramatic and fundamental reform focusing on incentives, transparency, and accountability. Those are the 3 most powerful forces. If we look at Social Security and Medicare, they're both already paying out more money than they're taking in. They have huge unfunded obligations. Do you realize that there are 10,000 Americans every day eligible for retirement? 10,000 a day? It's called a baby boom generation. And the federal budget is calculated on a cash basis. So when people retire, you not only have to start paying more benefits, you lose revenues because they're not working. And when you look at defense, as the Congressman mentioned, we spend as much as the next 15 nations combined on defense. And by the way, if you look at the list, most of them are allies. Now, in fairness, we're doing too much in this area. We're assuming too much of global security. Others aren't doing enough. We have the most powerful, the most effective, the most lethal military on the face of the earth. We have unparalleled weapon systems. But we're doing a lot of things based on past threats rather than current future threats. The Pentagon is a bloated bureaucracy, and they're going to have to restructure their pension and health obligations too. And if we look at infrastructure, we're now number 17 in the world in infrastructure, and infrastructure is key to improving economic growth and our competitive posture. And if you look at taxes, most of our revenues come from individuals, either payroll taxes or through income taxes. And we do have a progressive tax system. The truth is that the wealthy pay a very high percentage of total payroll and income tax. And you can see here with the percentages, I think it's the top 1% have 17% of income, pay 23% of all taxes. Now we can debate whether it's progressive enough. But it is a progressive, and that counts both. We count income, payroll, and estate. But, by the way, I don't see the graphic. I'll tell you, we got two problems. Depending on the year, between 40 and 50% of Americans pay no income tax. Zippo. And a significant percentage get rebates through the Earned Income Tax Credit. Let me state that differently. We have almost as many people on the wagon as pulling the wagon. That's a dangerous disconnect in the democracy. Clearly below a certain level, the poverty level or whatever, that's understandable. But once you get to a certain level of income, you need to pay something. And obviously we need a progressive tax structure up to a reasonable limit. At the same point in time, the bucket problem, the very wealthy people have a lower effective tax rate than middle-income people. Why? Because the most wealthy people make their money based upon capital gains and dividends. And they're taxed at 15%. So you have to address both of those issues. You have to get more people paying, and you have to end up dealing with the effective tax rate. How you do that matters, and I'm happy to get into that in the Q&A. And we lose $1 trillion a year in revenues and deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions. This is backdoor spending. It's not subject to the budget. It's not in the financial statements. It's not appropriated. It's not authorized, and it's not re-examined. It ought to be treated, these ought to be treated just the same as direct spending. They're just spending by another name. I'm sorry. Here's the point that I was trying to make. These are the effective tax rates by income level. And you can see in the first three areas, people get rebates. And at the top, the median effective income tax rate for people making over $1 million a year. For the record, I'm not in that category. Somebody needs to fix this flag. That's not acceptable. Thank you. Is 18.9%. How can that be when the top marginal tax rate is 35%? Because of what I told you. And what about states? Bad news flows downhill. The federal government's promised too much, going to have to restructure. It's going to spend less, and it's going to ask for more revenue. And states rely upon the federal government for 33 to 42% of the revenues, and localities rely upon states. So when the restructuring comes, bad news flows downhill. And states and localities have their own problems, in many cases driven by off-balance sheet obligations, underfunded pensions, unfunded retiree health obligations, etc. And when you add those for the states, the best state in the union is Wyoming. The worst state in the union, unfortunately, I live in, Connecticut. And I think you're number 39. You're number 39. So you're not worse, but you're well below average. We need to restructure at all levels of government. And when we restructure, we have to recognize the reality. These are four big myths. We can grow our way out. Bull. It would take double-digit real GDP growth for decades to grow out of a $65.5 trillion hole. Yes, we want more growth. We want pro-growth policy. We can't come close to where we're at. Second, we can inflate our way out. Well, with this inflation, we're paying back the debt below. You can't inflate your way out. Because the problem's the off-balance sheet obligations that grow faster than inflation and faster than the economy when the economy grows. We can tax our way out. We would have to double all federal taxes on young people in order to solve this problem. That's not equitable, it's not acceptable, it's not moral, it's not ethical. Fourthly, we can cut our way out. We would have to shred the social safety net, compromise other basic elements of federal responsibility, including national security. So we've got to put everything on the table. Everything's got to be, in my view, 3-part spending reduction, excluding interest, 1 part revenue. But how you achieve that matters. And when you achieve that matters. So let's look forward. These are the systemic challenges of government at all levels. You can read as well as I can, but these don't have boundaries. They don't have boundaries between levels of government or across the world. Washington uses words that don't mean the same thing as Webster's dictionary. You wonder why government's got a credibility problem? When they say cut, they mean reduce the rate of increase, not cut. When they say trust funds, you can't trust them. They're not funded. We're going to have to reimpose tough budget controls. We need to recapture budget flexibility. We need every area of the federal budget to be subject to an annual spending limit other than 2. Number 1, Social Security. We can reform it, make the numbers work. We don't have to have an annual limit because we can control it because it's a math exercise. And second, interest on the debt, because you can't. You got to pay what you got to pay. And by the way, that's where we have huge risk. By the way, we will never default on our debt. Why? The 14th Amendment to the Constitution would only guarantees two things. It guarantees bondholders and it guarantees military pensions. Nothing else. Social Security is not guaranteed, Medicare, Medicaid, nothing else is guaranteed, and the Supreme Court has already ruled on that. So we won't, all right? But the fact of the matter is we don't want to have to be in the position of deciding which bills we're going to pay and which ones we're not going to pay. That would send a terrible message to the markets and would further undermine confidence in our ability to answer. Social Security, I'll answer questions. We need to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, more savings-oriented. Focused more on the younger you are, the better off you are financially, the more you're going to be affected. Young people will get Social Security. Seniors will not be taken advantage of. I'm happy to answer questions. Medicare, Medicaid, and health care. We've got to be honest. We've way overpromised on health care. The Affordable Care Act is not sustainable, no matter what the Supreme Court decides. Let me give you an analogy of where our situation was before it was passed. If our health care system was a house, it was structurally unsound, mortgaged for more than it's worth, and headed for foreclosure. So what did the government do? Rather than ensuring the structural integrity, make sure we can make the mortgage payments, over time, it added a new wing on the house. Promised 32 million more people benefits. Asserted that it was paid for, whereas the chief actuary of Medicare said it wasn't even close to paid for, and called that progress. Look, we need universal health care, but it needs to be appropriate, affordable, and sustainable. Basic and essential, catastrophic, delivered through competition in the private sector, subject to an annual limit. I'm happy to get to more Q&A on that if you want. Defense and other spending. We must cut defense spending and constrain it while maintaining a minimum level, because it is a national security assured minimum level. In other words, it won't go below a certain amount. Could be more, depending upon threats, but it's less than it is now. We can do that without compromising national security. I was on the Defense Business Board for 8 years. The Defense Department's a bloated bureaucracy. There are ways to do it. Comprehensive tax reform. Simpler, fairer, more competitive, more equitable, and generate enough revenues to pay our bills and deliver on the promises we intend to keep. That means broader base, lower rates. That means providing deductions for corporations for dividends distributed. That means a territorial system of taxation. And I'm happy to get into specific examples about what the rates ought to be, what deductions and exemptions ought to be retained, which ones shouldn't be retained, etc. And constitutional amendments. We need constitutional amendments to deal with our finances, and we need constitutional amendments to deal with our political system. And I'm happy to get into Q&A on that. When you're passing legislation, these are the 6 tests. This is a best solutions test. If you pass all 6, it's a best solution. If you don't, it's BS. And that doesn't stand for best solution. Do they make economic sense? Are they pro-growth? Are they socially equitable? Do they recognize that we need a solvent, sustainable, and secure social safety net in this country? Are they culturally acceptable? Americans will not accept the size of government or level of taxation of Europe. Do they pass a math test? This is the new 4-letter word. If you're trying to balance the budget, if you're trying to stabilize debt to GDP, which is what I think the target ought to be, stabilize debt to GDP at a reasonable and sustainable level below where we are now, then do you have a plan that works, reasonable assumptions, and that the math works? Are they politically feasible? Can you pass the House? Can you get 60 votes in the Senate? And can you get a presidential signature? And last but not least, can you get bipartisan support? Because if you can't get meaningful bipartisan support, it will not be sustained. The Affordable Care Act was passed on a straight party line vote. It will not be sustained. The Ryan budget was passed on a straight party line vote. It won't be enacted by the Senate. That's all show. That's politics, not progress. And these are the things that we have to start asking ourselves. You realize the U.S. government is the largest, the most important entity on the face of the earth. It's been in existence since 1789, and it doesn't have 3 things that you have to achieve sustainable success. Number 1, a plan. There's no plan. I mean, I don't believe rushing into things, but 1789? Secondly, it's got no budget. It hadn't had a budget in 3 years. And even when it has a budget, it only controls less than 40% of expenses. And thirdly, it's got no metrics. It's got no metrics that help to say, are we succeeding? Are we failing? Are we making progress? How do we compare? It's 0 for 3. Ladies and gentlemen, in early April, that's a strikeout. And it's no wonder that we have problems. We've got to deal with these 4 issues. This is what Ross Perot ran on 20 years ago. Fiscal irresponsibility, political dysfunctionality, lack of trust in government, declining confidence in our future. We are demonstrably worse off on all 4. 20 years ago, 22% of Americans were independents, 42 are today. I've been one for 17 years. 20 years ago, 58% of Americans had confidence in government. Today, 20% have confidence in government. These are the numbers on debt to GDP. Ross Perot didn't win a single electoral vote, but he woke up America. He helped set President Clinton's agenda. We made great progress from 1993 to 2000. All the budget controls expired in 2002, and you can see what the heck has happened after that. So go to these websites. Take 10 minutes. Take the fiscal IQ quiz. 30 questions, true, false, agree, disagree. Find out what you know. Find out what you don't know. Find out whether or not you're part of the solution or part of the problem. FiscalIQ.net. Go to our website, either tcai.org, or we just changed the name of it yesterday. You can get there through that, keepingamericagreat.org. Check out No Labels, which is a new political movement for Democrats, Republicans, and Independents who want to value progress over partisanship and results over rhetoric. And check out AmericansElect.org, which will field, for the first time, a unity ticket, meaning they can't be the same political party, for President and Vice President this year, to be determined by the end of June. In summary, we're a great country, but not as great as we think we are. We've got serious problems. We need to get on to solving the problems. The 3 biggest deficits we have are truth, leadership, and solutions. 2012 is incredibly important. You need to hold elected officials responsible and accountable for what is their plan to solve this problem. Because if we solve this problem, our future can be better than our past. If we don't, our best years are behind us. And the clock is ticking, time is not working in our favor. And the other good news is, Americans typically rise to the challenge, hopefully before we have a crisis. We've done it in the past, hopefully we'll do it this time. If Sweden, if New Zealand, if Australia can do it, we can do it. Let's get on with it. But the 2 groups that need to be much more involved, business and young people, largely AWOL. It's time to come to the front lines. This is the future of our country, the future of our families. I'll do my part. All that I ask is that you do yours. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay. We've got just a couple minutes for just a couple of questions. Thank you, first of all, for a very enlightening conversation here. So a lot to take in a short period of time. First question is really talks about what do you propose to solve the Social Security problem?
All right, Social Security. I want you to listen carefully because I'm going to ask for a show of hands. The sooner we act, the more people can be put in a whole harmless position. The age is going to be 55 to 60, depending upon how quickly we act. Here's the deal. If you're 55 to 60, then little to no changes, because you don't have time to make adjustments. The younger you are, the better off you are financially, the more you're going to be affected. You have more time to adjust and more financial ability to deal with it. We have to increase the replacement rate for people near the poverty level because too many Americans rely solely on Social Security for their retirement income. We need to have a means-tested supplement for people over 85, means-tested, because too many people are outliving their retirement savings. We need to maintain a benefit for middle and upper income, but somewhat less of a replacement rate than right now. So somewhat more means-tested, but not fully means-tested. We don't want this to be a welfare program. We need to increase the normal retirement age and the early retirement age 2 to 3 years, phased in prospectively over 20 to 30 years. We need to look at how we calculate inflation for seniors because it's different than it is for other segments of the population. If you do those things, you can solve the problem, but to get a political deal, you're going to have some revenues on the table. Rather than increasing the tax rate, which is regressive, increase but do not eliminate the taxable wage-based cap from about $110,000 to about $150,000, but do not eliminate it. If you do that, it's solvent, sustainable, secure, forever. Forever. And every generation gets more than they think they're going to get. Young people think they get nothing. Shinola, they're wrong. Seniors think they're going to get taken advantage of. I could use other words, but I won't. They're not. And on top of the solvent, sustainable, secure, base defined benefit program, you add a supplemental savings account, 2 to 3% of pay. Payroll deduction goes into a real trust fund with real investments, with real fiduciary responsibility and liabilities that would help to increase our savings rate, help people understand the miracle of compounding, that would give them a pre-retirement death benefit, a supplemental retirement benefit, and something to leave to their heirs. Now, how many of you believe, that's not perfect, but that is a reasoned and reasonable framework for Social Security reform? Please raise your hands high. How many people don't? Please raise your hands high. One. I have gone to 49 states, and I've always had 95% plus. So what's the problem? No leadership. The Democrats are in denial about the need to renegotiate the social insurance contract. The Republicans are in denial that we're going to have some revenues. So where do we go? Nowhere.
Well, that last question would come into how can we change that in terms of where will we get the leadership to address the debt and these unfunded liabilities with these entitlements, which are so difficult to address? And we'll make that our last question.
Short-term and structural. Short-term, two things have to happen. The first three words of the Constitution have to come alive. We the people. They're the most powerful. They're the most important. So that's why this election is so important. Educate and engage the public. Disproportionate responsibility upon business and community leaders and young people. Secondly, the President of the United States, whoever that is, whether it's Barack Obama in the second term, Mitt Romney or somebody else in their first term, they're going to have to make this a priority. They're going to have to commit to use the bully pulpit to go directly to the people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, why we have to act sooner rather than later, the consequences if we don't, the benefits of doing so, lay out a framework, employ a unity approach. They need a unity of cabinet, and they need to make sure that the public brings pressure on the Congress, which is a dysfunctional body, and a committee, and you cannot run a country by committee. Pressure on the Congress to act in the public interest rather than their personal or political interests. There are always exceptions. On the structural, we need redistricting reform. We need to maximize the number of competitive districts consistent with the Voting Rights Act, not minimize the number of competitive districts. We need integrated and open primaries, no Republican primaries, no Democratic primaries. You pull it together, you have one primary, the top two vote getters run off in the general. The parties can endorse candidates, they can raise money for candidates, they can provide ground troops. We've got to get a lot more people voting in primaries. We need to recognize that 42% and increasing of the population are independents. We need to empower the sensible center. This is a center-right country. That's where the solutions are. That's not where our politics are. They're right, they're left, and the sensible center is largely unrepresented. We need campaign finance reform and term limits. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, not just for outlining the problems, but most importantly for outlining solutions. I strongly encourage you to go to the website. You can find it very useful. I want to thank each one of you for coming. As he mentioned, I know it's spring break and it's springtime, but this is a very, very important issue to our country. I appreciate you coming. This is kind of the first step, though. You got informed, you need to follow up. You need to really encourage your other family members, your friends, and your other employees to get educated, to get informed about this issue. We'll work to give you other websites. We'd like to make sure from a Grand Rapids business community standpoint, we'll give you alternatives. He has an excellent website with lots of solutions, but we'll look to give you some other ideas for other people to look at and listen to look at these unfunded liabilities, to understand how we can deal with them and how we can move forward. So thank you very much. Have a great day.